One of our most popular guests is back. In her first appearance in episode 8, we discussed midlife relationships and intimacy, especially important in the wake of menopause and the many life changes thrown at us in midlife. This time, our licensed sex and relationship therapist and I unpack infidelity, its aftermath, and then also ethical non-monogamy and polyamory. I have to tell you, this was really eye-opening and thought-provoking for me. A staggering 40 to 45% of American marriages are hit by infidelity, with about 60% of those marriages opting to stay together. But the divorce rates for open or ethical non-monogamous relationships are not that promising. Health, wellness, career, relationships, and everything in between. We're removing the taboo from what really matters in midlife. I'm your host, Michelle Folan, and this is Asking for a Friend. Welcome to the show. We are super excited to have Julie Hattershire back to the podcast. Julie is a licensed sex and relationship therapist with a master's in social work and has been in private practice since 2005. And the name of her practice is Be Connected Counseling and Coaching, and it's located here in Cincinnati. And I don't know if I shared with you, Julie, that the first show that we did was one of the highest rated for the podcast.
Oh, that's really flattering.
Yeah.
That says a lot about how great this is for people and how wonderful a podcast host you are.
Oh.
And also, that was really nice to hear. Thank you.
Yeah. I knew when we first spoke that we decided at that time that we would probably have to do a second show because there are so many topics in the realm of relationships and marriage that we could talk about. That being said, welcome.
Thank you.
Is there anything else you want to share with the listeners before we get started?
I'm just delighted to be back, and I'm really excited about talking about the topics that we have on tap for today because they're things that I see in my office a lot. They're things that I know many of my friends and family are dealing with. I think it's great to be able to talk about them in a really open and honest way and get people the information that they need, get it into their hands so they can figure out how they want to live their lives. I think it's great.
One thing that I have really emphasized with the podcast as well is that it's okay to seek help.
Yes.
There should not be this stigma around seeking help and getting guidance and therapy because a lot of great things can come out of that.
I completely agree. One of my missions in life, other than doing really good therapy with my clients, is to try to destigmatize the whole concept of getting help and getting therapy, either as an individual or for your relationship. We therapists are just people living our lives, doing the same thing all y'all are doing. We are here to help you figure out your path because we have some knowledge and some education and experience that you don't, but really understand we're also walking our own life journeys, doing things that make sense and making mistakes and living life. We're just normal people here to help you. One of the things I hope to do is destigmatize the idea of getting help for your relationship or getting help for yourself.
Thank you for saying that. On that note, we decided that talking a little bit more about infidelity. We did touch on infidelity and a bit about forgiveness, but I really wanted to dig into infidelity. And the first question, I actually did get quite a few questions from listeners.
Okay.
The first one was, when you're working with couples that are seeking counseling due to infidelity,
yeah,
who is most often stepping out of the relationship?
I'm going to tell you, it's almost nearly 50-50. The types of affairs that men and women have tend to differ along gender lines. Since women in the early 80s, it was the first generation of women to come out of college expecting that we would have careers and support ourselves. Not that women didn't do that before, but this was the first generational cohort of women moving into the workforce as an expectation, and that we would have careers and support ourselves. And many, if not most of us, kept our careers at least partway through our marriage. For the first time ever, women were in the workforce in great numbers. Well, for the first time in a long time, not ever, in conjunction with men. Women's access to men who were not their husbands increased pretty dramatically. And also, women having extramarital affairs increased pretty dramatically, and the two correlated. In my office and statistically in our field, we see that it's pretty much 50-50, but the types of affairs that men and women have differ. Women tend, and this is generalization, so keep that in mind, women tend to have affairs that are more relationship based, and men tend to have affairs that are more opportunistic, that are more about, and I'm not just saying one night stands, but this person happens to be in their presence, they engage in an affair. Women's tend to be more emotional and relational in addition to physical. Men's tend to be more physical with secondarily emotional and relational components.
Ah, and you know what? That makes a lot of sense, honestly.
It does, because women generally in our society tend to be the more relational gender. And again, I'm speaking in broad, sweeping generalities. Don't hold me to that. There are always exceptions. But we tend to be the more relational gender. Men tend to be the more physical gender. Generally speaking, that does make sense. But also from an evolutionary perspective, it makes some sense if you think back to, if we want to perpetuate the species, males need to impregnate as many females as possible in order for any species to continue. Females, being historically the smaller, weaker sex, need to have men there to protect them. So it makes sense that we would be more concerned about the relationship and they would be more concerned about the physicality. Now, that is back in primitive times. We now live in modern times, but much of our body and brain and wiring is still fairly primitive. That also comes into play.
When you just said that, I started thinking about the animal kingdom.
Yes.
As a whole.
Yes, which we are.
There is a correlation there, is that animals are not, well, there are some animals that are monogamous.
Yes.
But are we not wired to be monogamous?
Well, there's a lot of debate about that. The reality is we are not wired naturally to do a lot of things that we do. We are not wired naturally to live in close proximity and enclosed spaces with each other, and yet we do. There are a lot of things that biologically we may not be wired to do that we have adapted to because of the way our society has grown since humans have been on the planet. When people say we're not wired for monogamy, sometimes that sounds like an excuse for why they behave the way they behave. And the reality is there are a lot of things that we are not biologically wired to do that we do anyway.
Okay.
Because they make sense for the greater good of society. They make sense for the greater good of the human population.
When you're working with couples,
yeah,
realistically, can people really recover, whether it's the man or the woman, or, I mean, gosh, I shouldn't even say that because it could be female, female, male, male. Do people ever really, truly recover from that? They do.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And a lot of us couple therapists specialize in affair recovery for that very reason. And in fact, not only recover, but so many of the couples I've worked with over the years come out of the affair, the aftermath of the infidelity, happier, healthier, and stronger than before they went in. It actually turns out to be a very good thing for their relationship, even though it was a crisis point.
Uh-huh.
It brought them to new realizations about their relationship, about themselves, about what they want in the world. They created a higher level of transparency and connection and intimacy through the work that they did to recover from the affair. And yes, it is possible to do it. I will say it's very hard to do without help. It's very hard to do without expert guidance of some sort or another, whether that's a therapist or a clergy person, or even self-help books or some of those marriage retreats that focus on reconnecting couples. It's very difficult to do without help, but it is definitely possible. And in fact, happens pretty frequently in not only my office, but the offices of the other couples and marriage therapists that I know.
Then there's the trust factor.
Mm-hmm.
How do you work a couple through the trust factor?
Trust is interesting because it's really a two-part process. One part is someone needs to be trustworthy. They need to show up in a way that they can be trustworthy. And the other is that trust is always a choice. It's always a leap of faith. Sometimes it's a leap across a crack in the sidewalk, and sometimes it's the Grand Canyon, but it's always a leap of faith. Someone can be totally trustworthy, and someone else can choose not to trust them. And I think we all have experiences of having trusted someone in our life who was not trustworthy. It's a two-part process. And when you're working with a couple who is recovering from any kind of a betrayal, infidelity or any kind of a betrayal, we have to set one partner up to be more trustworthy than they have been, the offending partner, more trustworthy than they have been. And then we have to help the hurt partner get to a point where they choose to trust. Oftentimes in relationships, people say, and I've heard people say this about lots of different relationships, I'm going to trust them till they give me a reason not to. And I say, oh, that's entirely the wrong way to go about it. What you ideally need to do is give people the opportunity to earn your trust and to show that they are trustworthy. Then you choose to give them that trust, and then they earn more and you choose to give them more. When we go through that process after there's been a betrayal, we set the offending partner up to be actively involved in earning their partner's trust back. The hurt partner then actively involved in figuring out what they would need to be able to trust again. It's an interactive, engaged process that both people participate in.
Okay. Then the other question I got from a listener was, and it sounds like this was a specific situation, but maybe this is a sister or a good friend of this person. The husband stepped out. He had left the family for the younger girlfriend.
Uh-huh.
They are now expecting a child.
Mm-hmm.
Now, according to this, the kids are in late teens, early 20s, and now they are going to have a baby sibling. And the kids are really struggling.
I'm sure.
With this. What kind of advice do you typically give in that situation where you've got kids that now you're dealing with their sorrow?
Well, oftentimes when children find out about affairs, and I always hope they don't, but they frequently do, they have in some ways a more difficult time getting past it and moving on than the hurt spouse does or the hurt partner does. When I'm looking at children who are not actually children, they are young adults, late teens, early adulthood, one of the things I would say to them is I would give them permission to not have much of a relationship with that offending parent if they want, to not have to be older siblings to this younger sibling, to be willing to say, that was your choice. You made that decision. It doesn't work for me. It doesn't work for us. We're going to take some steps back, and for that to be okay. Just because they're family doesn't mean they have to be in your lives. But if they want that relationship with their other parent and their baby sibling, or if they don't know whether they do or they don't, counseling can certainly help. Family therapy can certainly help for the father, his new bride, not the baby, obviously, and the children. That can certainly be beneficial. I would tell the mom in this case of the young adults to support their autonomy in this process and to say, okay, you don't have to. You don't have to be okay with it.
Yeah.
And to support them in working through that process.
That makes sense to me. You have to give them a choice in the matter because they got stuck in a situation which they did not choose.
Exactly.
There's a grieving process to this.
Oh, yeah.
I think about the spouse who is grieving, and then you've got the kids that are grieving. And now I'm thinking, boy, the counseling piece is super important for the family at this point.
I also think we need to recognize that in this particular scenario, the man who left his marriage is also grieving, I'm sure. He's grieving the loss of some kind of relationship with his other children. It may not be a complete rupture or break, but it certainly is a different kind of relationship. There is probably some grief going along with his choices and his process as well. Everybody in that situation is struggling in one way or another, I would have to believe. Differently so, but nonetheless struggling.
Are there stages of grief that you see
There are stages, but when we say stages, what I want to caution people on is it's not linear.
We'll be right back after this quick break. There are many wonderful things about midlife to celebrate, but vaginal dryness is not on that list. Add relief to your routine like I did with Revaree from Bonafide Health. Revaree is naturally powered with hyaluronic acid and scientifically validated to rejuvenate vaginal tissue and replenish moisture. No mess, no stress. Go to hellobonafide.com and use code AFAF25 at checkout to receive 25% off your subscription for any of Bonafide's sexual health and wellness products. You deserve lasting comfort, so check out Revaree at hellobonafide.com. Welcome back to the show.
There was the 5 stages of grief that came out many, many decades ago, and it's accurate, but it's not complete because they're not linear. You go back and forth between bargaining and anger and acceptance and total sadness and depression and abject loneliness and triumph. It's this process that's more like a mobile than a flow chart or a spreadsheet, and it's kind of all over the place. It's less linear and more ephemeral than stages. But yes, there certainly is a grief process that people go through.
Can you ever stop obsessing about that other person that entered your marriage without your permission?
Yes. First of all, oftentimes people find they stop obsessing about that other person when they themselves get a life that they love, when they themselves create on the back end of this divorce or this rupture of the relationship, if they weren't married, when they create a life that they love, whether that includes a partner or not, they find that they are doing well and oftentimes better on the back end of that than they were before. They're happier, they're healthier, or they are happy and healthy and well adjusted. There is actual therapy for obsession. If they still find after a period of time that they are obsessively ruminating, that they can't get this out of their head, we therapists know how to help them with that. There are really great therapeutic modalities for obsessive thinking and for intrusive thoughts and for that running on that hamster wheel in your head. We can help with that. Again, therapy can be a really great adjunct to just the normal grieving and reintegration after the end of a relationship.
It goes way deeper than trolling the person on social media.
Sometimes it can. I've heard of some pretty crazy things that people have done, some pretty significant things people have done.
Oh, I can only imagine. You got my mind going on that one. I was like, oh.
You're probably not far off. I've heard, and not only I have, but my other couples therapist friends have heard some really significant, dramatic stuff that people have done.
How do you get people to feel like they're good enough? Because I know that people will start to feel like they aren't good enough. What did I do? How did I fail? How do you get them on the other side of that?
Well, first, if they were sitting in my office, I would look at what actually their contribution to the situation was, because it is almost never 100% the offending partner and no sense of responsibility at all for the other partner. I would have them take a look at, okay, what do you think you might have contributed to this situation? How do you think you might have done it differently? How can you learn from this? What can you take away to make yourself a better version of yourself? And let's put the responsibility for what actually their responsibility was on them, the choices they made, the decisions they made, the way they chose to handle things. We start to tease apart this whole big mess of infidelity, what belongs to them and what pieces of it belong to you. Oftentimes, Michelle, I have women in midlife in my office who will say, honestly, if I never had sex again, I wouldn't care. And the men that they are with are like, oh, I really, really, really miss it. I really, really miss it. Now, not all of those men are going to have affairs, but if that happens to be the situation, one of the things I would say is, so you told your husband he's not allowed to have something that he wants and needs, that he has an appetite for. He was just supposed to be completely content with giving that up like you are. That isn't actually making sense. You unilaterally broke your marital agreement, and then he unilaterally broke it by having an affair. Those are the kinds of conversations I would have with them to help them understand their responsibility. And that obviously is man and cheating woman faithful. It could easily go the other way. What's their responsibility in it? And then what can they learn from that? And how can they be healthier and happier moving forward from there?
What should we not do after infidelity other than stalking?
Actually, that's a big one. We can certainly talk about not doing that. I would say the first thing, Michelle, the biggest and first thing is do not involve your children. Do not involve your children. It is damaging to children to know that one of their parents had an affair. And sometimes it's inevitable. Sometimes actually it's the children who discover it. But if you have the option to not involve your children at whatever age they are, don't do that, because the discovery of an affair can permanently alter and damage the relationship children have with their other parent. I have seen more often than not a couple where the children know that one parent had an affair. The couple works to put their relationship back together. They have a happier, healthier dynamic. And now the children are distant from both of them because they don't understand and they can't wrap their arms around it and they can't come to accept it. Whereas if they hadn't told the children in the first place, it would have been a much smoother process. Children are damaged by parents' affairs. Please, that's the first thing not to do. Don't involve your children if you don't have to.
Julie, what else should we refrain from?
Don't stalk the affair partner. Ideally, don't tell the affair partner's partner because you have no idea what goes on in their house. I had a couple come to me and one of them told the affair partner's spouse, and there were guns in the house, and there was a gun held to the offending partner. There was a gun held to the head of the spouse of the offending partner. The police were called. Somebody went to jail. Somebody went to the hospital. It was a really dangerous situation.
Ooh.
Because you don't know what the affair partner of your spouse lives with, I would encourage you not to tell the other spouse. Lots of people do it. They feel like they have a right to know. I understand that. But there's this whole other life out there that you don't know about. There's this whole other relational dynamic you don't know about, and it can create incredible problems. So that would be another thing not to do.
Okay.
The third thing I would say is don't make any rash decisions. Don't make any rash decisions that you're going to have a hard time walking back. In fact, we were driving not that long ago somewhere and saw a whole big pile of stuff on the front lawn of a house. It looked to be man's stuff. It was golf clubs and suits hanging out of boxes. And I'm thinking, oh, that was an evening that didn't go well. Don't make any really rash decisions that you then have to walk back from. Try to remain as calm as you can in the face of abject pain and incredible heartbreak. Think through what actually makes sense for you as a person, as a couple, as a family. Get help as quickly as you can. The sooner you start seeing somebody to help you work through this, the quicker the progress is going to be. People often wait a really long time, and then it's sort of festered. There's a lot of bitterness and resentment that we have to untangle before we can actually get to what really happened and what healing might need to occur.
When you have clients that are at that point where they're like, I'm out.
Yeah.
I'm not going to forgive. How do you work through that process? Because the level of your hurt is up to here. When do you say, yeah, okay, I get where you're coming from?
I definitely get where they're coming from. And I would like to define a couple of things. First of all, forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation or staying together. You can forgive somebody and still choose to split. The forgiveness piece is really about coming to an acceptance that this happened, coming to some understanding of why it happened, and saying, I choose not to carry this burden of pain and bitterness and anger and resentment around with me anymore. That doesn't mean I want you in my life as my partner. If you have children together, you're still going to be in each other's lives, but I don't want you in my life as a partner. But I choose not to carry this anger and bitterness and resentment around with me because it's not harming you. It's harming me. It's weighing me down. Forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. You can forgive and still split. And oftentimes people say, I just can't do it. I don't want this relationship. Many times they'll say, honestly, wasn't that great to begin with? I don't know that there's really all that much to repair here. I've kind of moved to a different level. We've grown apart, we've evolved differently, we want different things in life. Sometimes the betrayal is so severe that there's just no putting it back together again. It's completely shattered. And in that case, I say, great. Then if you have children together, let's work together to help you take this apart as carefully and kindly as possible so that your children are not damaged and so that you can remain at least cordial and cooperative in co-parenting your children. You're bound for life when you have kids together. The better able you are to work together for their well-being, the happier and healthier everybody is going to be. I actually do a lot of work around helping people take relationships apart and doing it effectively and kindly and with as little emotional bloodshed as possible.
That's really neat. I'm glad we talked about that because I think there is a way to do it right.
There absolutely is. There are many ways to do it right, and there are many ways to do it wrong. Again, it's not necessarily something that a couple in the middle of it would know or be able to understand or be able to pull themselves far enough out to take an objective look at it and say, this is the best way to do it. But we therapists, couples and relationship therapists, we know what works and what doesn't work. We can certainly offer guidance and support in taking marriages apart. Family law attorneys, they don't like being called divorce attorneys, will refer their clients to therapists to help them do that.
The next topic we wanted to cover was one that I know I find a little controversial, but it did come up in a discussion recently, and I felt it was worth exploring with you. It was the topic of ethical non-monogamy. First of all, how do you define ethical non-monogamy?
I look at it as a big umbrella definition with lots of pieces underneath it. And the first thing I would say is that we in our society have this belief, and I'm not saying it's a wrong belief, that when you are in a romantic and sexual relationship, a committed relationship, that means monogamy. That means that you and that person are only putting your romantic and sexual and relational energy toward each other in that relationship. That works well for a lot of people. That doesn't work well for everybody. There is this other umbrella term that's non-monogamy. And non-monogamy covers anything that isn't monogamy. But under that umbrella term, there is this smaller umbrella that's ethical non-monogamy. And that is when people in a relationship have an understanding and an agreement that there are various ways that other people can be in that relationship as well. It can cover a lot of different things. It can cover swinging. It can cover if one person is heterosexual and the other person's sexuality is more fluid, that they get to have relationships with other genders and other sexes and other people, as long as they're not having a relationship with someone of the same gender as their primary partner. It can include a couple inviting a third in, so there's a threesome, and they are all being sexual together. But the difference between that and infidelity, and when you first brought these two topics to me, I said, I have some discomfort about putting them next to each other, because ethical non-monogamy, the difference is everybody is on the same page. Everybody agrees with what's going on. There is consent, there is understanding, there is open communication. Affairs, that is not the case. Affairs, one person knows something's going on and the other person doesn't. That's the rupture in the relationship. Ethical non-monogamy, everybody is on board. These are agreements that everybody involved has made. And if those agreements don't work for them anymore, they address them and they modify them. And in non-monogamous relationships, there can still be cheating. And when there is, it can be just as upsetting and just as damaging as in monogamous relationships. That's how I define ethical non-monogamy. Everybody in the situation understands that there are more people involved in the situation than just the two of them, and they all agree to the parameters around that.
Back to what you said earlier about women being more emotional.
Mm-hmm.
Their attachments are more emotional.
Generally speaking, yep.
Generally speaking. Isn't that hard for a woman to have that physical connection with another man and not become emotionally bonded or attached to that person?
Well, it can be hard for both genders to do that. oftentimes in ethical non-monogamous relationships, the agreement will allow for some level of attachment. It doesn't have to be just completely anonymous, attachmentless sex. Oftentimes, it will allow for some level of friendship and connection and attachment. And in fact, polyamory is a flavor of ethical non-monogamy where it's not just about sex or sexuality, but it's actually about relationships. You love more than one person. You are loved by more than one person. That is actually the definition of polyamory. And in those cases, in the polycules, which can be very small or very big, everybody has some level of emotional attachment to others in that polycule. Maybe not everybody to everybody, but everybody to others in that polycule has some level of emotional attachment. And if you think about it, Michelle, our romantic relationships are the only one in our society that we really only let you have one of at a time. So you can have multiple children, and most people don't say, well, how could you love your seventh child? Because you had one already. You're supposed to put all your love toward that. We have multiple friends. We have multiple siblings and family members that we love, and we love them differently. We have our relationship with each of them differently. But we have lots of relationships in our society. That's completely allowed. I can tell you, I have several friends that I love dearly and deeply. They are my nearest and dearest people. And nobody looks askance at that. Nobody thinks twice of that. I love both of my sons differently, but I love them deeply. Nobody looks askance at that. But if I had my boyfriend and another boyfriend, people would be like, what? And that's the only relationship that we do that with.
Yeah.
In our society.
Well, I could see, people like, well, I've got a lot of love to give,
Uh-huh.
With that, to me, if I'm being totally frank, I would be really jealous. I couldn't get out of my own way if my husband was like, hey, let's invite somebody else into this. Like, no, I don't share.
Exactly. A lot of people are wired that way. They don't like to share that. That is something that is really important to them, is this idea that it's just you and me in this relationship. That's fine. There's nothing to say they have to explore non-monogamy. For a lot of other people, that feels very confining and constricting. And oftentimes, those are the people who are in a monogamous relationship who find it confining and constricting, who end up having affairs because there's this desire or this urge they have to explore outside that relationship, but the relationship itself doesn't allow for that. For those people, getting into or transitioning their current relationship into one that's ethically non-monogamous might actually be better for everybody involved. Because one of the things that people who've been betrayed by an affair tell me repeatedly is that it's not so much the affair, it's all the lies. I'm looking back over our entire relationship and I'm second guessing everything because this was going on and I didn't know anything about it. He was texting her on my birthday. She was seeing him on my work trip. It's all the lies and all the secrecy and all the hiding that is a huge part of the sense of betrayal. And when you're in an ethically non-monogamous relationship, you have significantly less of that. Everybody is on board with what's happening and everybody is in agreement with what's happening. And if they're not, then you talk about it. And jealousy does come up in the longest and happiest and healthiest E&M relationships. There's still jealousy. There's still this sense of insecurity or this sense of I don't want to share you. And oftentimes when that happens, the couples that I work with will say, we need to take a break. I'm having a hard time with this right now. I want you to pull back from yours. I'm going to pull back from mine. We need to refocus on this relationship and get this to a better place. And then we need to see what we do from there.
Is this more common than I think?
I don't know how common you think it is, but I will tell you that it's more common than many people know. And a lot of people practice ethical non-monogamy, and only the people they're being ethically non-monogamous with know about it. There is a club in, I think, Middletown called Club Cinday. It's a sex club where a lot of people go to find out what about this ethical non-monogamy community appeals to them. They have pretty strong membership. My understanding is their club's pretty full most nights. So there are a lot of people who are exploring this and interested in this to some degree or another. Yet they don't talk about it because in our society, and particularly in conservative Cincinnati, it's just not something that's easily discussed in coffee table or cocktail hour chit chat.
This is off the cuff, but Do you remember that show that was on television? And it did focus on this couple up in Mason, which is,
Yep.
for listeners, that's a suburb of Cincinnati. It got taken off the air because I think it was so controversial, and the people in the neighborhood were not happy that this was highlighting their area in a negative light.
I never saw it, but I know of it. I will tell you that it is pretty common for people to engage in some degree of this to some extent or another. We just don't hear about it because that's not what you talk about at the water cooler on Monday morning. What'd you do this weekend? Oh, we went out to a party. They don't talk about it was a hotel takeover and everybody there was in and out of everybody else's bedrooms, which is a thing.
Oh my God. I am learning. We're never too old to learn.
No, and it's a fascinating aspect of our culture. And I love working with ethically non-monogamous couples and ethically non-monogamous individuals trying to figure out and navigate this. And it's challenging. It's challenging. Monogamy is challenging too, though. Again, if you are someone who feels that you want to live this non-monogamous life and you find yourself in a monogamous relationship, that requires a level of self-control and self-management that is challenging sometimes. Conversely, if you are someone who really is wired for monogamy and you are with a partner who is ethically non-monogamous, that requires a level of self-management that is also difficult at times. There's no easy answer.
Is there a difference between polyamory and open relationships, or are they the same thing?
Well, the definition of polyamory, as most people use it, Michelle, is that I love or can love more than one person. Not I can be in a relationship with, but I can romantically love more than one person at the same time. And that I can accept and feel romantically loved by more than one person at the same time. Polyamory, amor being the word for love, really is not just about the activities we engage in, but the emotional connection with which we do that. Open relationships can be polyamorous, but they don't necessarily have to be. They can also be just physical and sexual in nature. Polyamory really connects that emotional connection, that love component to it that isn't always there.
I will tell you what brought this whole topic up was I was having a discussion with some people that I work with, and we were talking about a pineapple.
Uh-huh.
It's like I just fell off the apple cart. So we were talking about...
You fell off the pineapple cart.
I did fall off the pineapple cart. I'm like, what? The conversation was, hey, my neighbor, they've got this pineapple on their front porch, and I, just to mess with them, I turn it over and make it upside down, which is some kind of symbol that you are swinging couples. I'm like, what? No, a pineapple, that's a welcoming type of symbol. Hospitality. And he's like, yeah, not that kind of hospitality. That's why I brought this topic up. I was like, how common is this really? And I said, well, okay, we're just going to have a conversation with Julie about this.
Yeah, the upside down pineapple is a sign that a couple or an individual is open to including other people in their sex lives in some way or another. It's hospitality if it's right side up, and it's a different kind of hospitality if it's upside down.
Oh, I'm so glad I asked. That was good. The last question I have for you, and this came from a listener. If you know that a friend or a relative's spouse is having an affair, what is your responsibility to tell that person that you know?
That's a tough question. That is a tough question. Partly, I think that depends on your relationship with the person in question and depends on what you understand of the relationship that the spouse is having or the partner is having. I think most people would say you have a responsibility to tell. But again, unless you know something about their relational dynamic, unless you know something about the emotional stability and well-being of the hurt spouse, the one who's not having the affair, and something about the emotional stability of the spouse that is having the affair. You also have to realize by doing so, you may be opening up a very different and much more dangerous can of worms. Again, to go back to the gun scenario that I talked about earlier, that's extreme, but there are a lot of people who've done really extreme things in face of such abject pain and abject betrayal. Not only, if you choose to tell, not only should you tell, but you should also provide or offer some support for the person and help them get to safety if that's needed, help them get to emotional well-being if that's needed, because it's not just as easy as your partner's having an affair, okay, get a divorce. There is a lot of drama that can go along with the discovery of that. And if you are the one who is lighting that match or lighting that fuse, you also need to be responsible for helping manage the aftermath of that. Many people will just drop that little nugget into the middle, that little hand grenade into the middle of a relationship and then walk away. And that's really highly irresponsible and potentially very dangerous.
Okay.
People do really impulsive things when they're in that much pain.
That's great advice. I think you really have to think that through and how you deal with that situation.
I agree.
All right. Thank you for that answer.
Yeah.
This was awesome. I just love having you on the show.
I love coming.
Oh, it's great.
I love our conversations. We always have the most interesting talks, don't we? And I love the topics and the questions that your listeners come up with. They're great. They're fabulous.
I am really lucky, Julie. I have a very engaged audience. I'm so pleased that people trust me enough to ask the questions and know that I will keep everything very confidential. I hope that trend continues. It does make the show a little special.
Oh, it really does.
In the dynamic that we've been able to build. Thank you for being here.
You're welcome.
And enjoy the rest of your day. It's lovely out.
It is beautiful.
Get your boxes unpacked.
I will. Thanks, Michelle.
All right. Thanks, Julie.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Follow Asking for a Friend on social media outlets and provide a review and share this show wherever you get your podcasts. Reviews and sharing help us grow.